Okay, welcome to another terrific program at Merowitz Center. Thanks for joining us. My name is Laura Bryant. Presidential Legacies has turned out to be one of our most popular series, so welcome back if you've already participated. Thus far, we have featured LBJ, Lincoln, Truman, and most recently, FDR. This afternoon, we're featuring a two-part program focusing on the amazing career of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And here to tell her story is Jeff Urbin, Education Specialist at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. Jeff, we are very happy to see you again. You are definitely one of our most popular speakers, and we cannot wait to hear what you have to say today.
Well, thank you very much. It's a tad disturbing to hear I'm one of the most popular, but I'll just have to work a little bit harder at that. So, hey, everybody, thanks for coming back to learn more about the Roosevelts. This time, we are focusing on Mrs. Roosevelt, a very important Roosevelt, equally important, I would say, to the other two major famous Roosevelts, Teddy and Franklin. Although it's only been in the last 25 years or so that we're really beginning to get an understanding of how important she was to the overall Roosevelt legacy. I mean, we all know she was an important first lady, and we all know that she went on to have a career after being first lady with the United Nations and such. But the scholarship that's coming out now is showing more and more just what a real partner she was in the Roosevelt administration. So what I'd like to do over the course of this session and the next session is to talk a little bit about who she was, how she became to be the Eleanor Roosevelt that we all know and love. And then that's going to be focusing on this session. And then the next session, we'll talk about some important turning points in her career and some ways and methods and techniques that she used to get so much done and to accomplish, so much. She made it look effortless, but she actually did have some real strategies for how to accomplish what it was that she was looking to do. And as Laura said, we'll do the questions at the end. If you have any questions or comments, in the meantime, that can't wait, just shoot them in the chat, and we'll see where we go from there. So I want to start off talking about, Eleanor Roosevelt and the understanding that we have of her, right? We know her as this pretty accomplished, this pretty put together, this pretty, directed and focused woman. And yet she did not start out that way at all. And very often people will ask me, well, you had to use one word to describe Mrs. Roosevelt. What would it be? And of course, you think of words like awesome or amazing, right? But, those words are so overused now, it's hard to get a sense of what that really means for somebody to be, oh, awesome, well, wow, that's amazing, right? So the two words I want to use to describe Mrs. Roosevelt are the words betrayal and compassion, okay? Betrayal and compassion. Mrs. Roosevelt was a woman who was constantly being betrayed in her life as she developed into who she was going to become. And yet she was also a woman who had this tremendous sense of compassion for other folks. So those are going to be the two words that I want you to keep in mind as we're talking about Mrs. Roosevelt: betrayal and compassion. So our story begins on October 11th, 1884, when Eleanor Roosevelt is born in New York City, and she's born into the Roosevelt clan. Now, Mrs. Roosevelt was actually a Roosevelt even before she was a Roosevelt, right? Because she married Franklin Roosevelt, but she was Eleanor Roosevelt from birth because she came from the Oyster Bay side of the family. And our president, President Roosevelt, is from the Hudson Valley side. So back in the 1670s, the first of the Roosevelts came to this country. He had two sons, and one created the Oyster Bay side of the family, which is Eleanor's side, and the other created the Hudson Valley side, which is the Franklin side. Generally speaking, the Roosevelts of the Hudson Valley pronounce their name Roosevelt. And the folks that are from Oyster Bay will generally pronounce their name as Roosevelt. So if you hear somebody talking about Teddy Roosevelt, that's right. If you hear somebody talking about Franklin Roosevelt, they're really using the wrong pronunciation. So, you can get yourself a couple of free drinks at a bar just pulling that on folks, and you're welcome. So the way it goes is this. She's born into this Roosevelt family, and her mother sees her as a disappointment, quite frankly. Her mother is a very well-to-do, well-connected, socialite, fancy lady there in, the New York City, social circles. And she has this daughter, and she's hoping this daughter will be this beautiful, lovely, waif-like little thing. And that's not quite what Eleanor was. And so right from the beginning, her mother sees her as a bit of a disappointment. And as Eleanor grows from a baby to a toddler, her mother gives her the nickname Granny. Okay. Now, you don't have to be a child psychologist to know that calling a kid, calling anybody a name is going to hurt their self-esteem. But if you're calling a little kid Granny because you think they look like a little old lady or they act like a little old lady, that is not going to be a good way to build a kid's self-esteem. And in fact, much of Eleanor Roosevelt's, lack of self-esteem, her shyness, her lack of confidence can be traced back pretty much to that. Now, here is a picture of Eleanor when she is about 3.5 years old. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that kid, right? I mean, the bangs might be a little bit severe here, okay? But who am I to talk about hairstyle, right? So the bangs might be a little bit tight there, but that's a perfectly good looking 3 or 4 year old. There's no reason to call that little kid Granny. And yet that's what her mother did. And she not only called her Granny to her face, she called her Granny in front of other people as well. So needless to say, she did not have a great relationship with her mother. And in fact, she then later had, the mother later had two sons, and she doted more on them and kind of, left Eleanor out as the ugly duckling. So I think of that as kind of the first betrayal, right? You have a mom and a dad, and your mom is supposed to, build a way for you in the world, right? Give you the skills you need, build your self-esteem so that you have some toughness to go out there and face the world. Now, Eleanor also, of course, as most of us do, had a dad, and her father was a neglected alcoholic. And what I mean by that is he never abused her or, hit her or anything like that, but he was a neglected alcoholic. And when he got to drinking, he would then tend to forget everything else. And Eleanor had this idyllic view of her father. To her, he could do no wrong. But that wasn't really quite the reality because he had this alcohol addiction. And the best story to tell about that is he promises her, hey, because he's away a lot, right? He's out, he's, going on junkets and things. And, it's not a real stable family environment there. And one time he's home and he says, hey, you know what? We're going to do a daddy-daughter day in New York, right? So listen, you plan a day, we'll go into New York, we'll do whatever you want to do. You want to go on a boat in Central Park? We'll do that. You want to see a show on Broadway? We'll do that. You want to go to one of the fabulous restaurants? We can do that. Top of the Empire, whatever you want. You plan the day and we're going to make it happen. Daddy-daughter day in New York. So she plans this big day. They get together on the day, they go into the city, and the first thing her father says is, oh, geez, totally forgot. I got a real quick meeting I got to go to. And he puts her down on the doorstep of this hotel, and he goes in and he goes into the bar and he proceeds to get drunk. And so Eleanor's waiting out there for her father to come out from this meeting. And she's waiting and sitting and waiting and sitting. Almost 2 hours goes by. And she finally tugs on the doorman's jacket and says, hey, when's my dad getting out of this meeting? This is supposed to be a quick meeting. And the doorman goes in to see what's going on. And he has to come out and tell her, well, little girl, your dad's been sent home in a taxi out the back door. He got drunk and we didn't want him going out the front door, of our hotel here. It's, bad for publicity. So, that's what happened to him. And then they had to call her a taxi and send her home as well. So here are two sources of betrayal, right? Your mother, who's supposed to love you and nurture you and have that motheriness and all that, and she doesn't. You're a little old lady in her eyes. Your father, who is also supposed to, take care of you and nurture you and these sorts of things. He puts alcohol in front of his love for his daughter. Now, this had a little bit less of an impact than the mother situation did. Eleanor would get letters from her father, and she kept those the rest of her life, took them from place to place, home to home. And she always had this idolized view of her dad. But nonetheless, he was not quite up to snuff in terms of good parenting. I'm not trying to judge here. I'm simply saying these are the facts. So by the time Eleanor is like 10 years old, both her mother and her father have passed away. Her mother dies of diphtheria, and her father dies of, surprise, complications from alcoholism. So now Eleanor is on her own with her little 2 baby brothers, and they get sent around from family member to family member to family member. So, okay, go off and hang out with this family member for a couple of weeks or a couple of months. So, well, she packs up and off she goes. And then it's like, well, Eleanor, it's been great having you, but you have to move on. So she goes to the next family member, and then to the next family member, the next family member. And again, in a sense, her extended family is betraying her, because you would hope if, your parents are gone, that your extended family is going to take you in and take care of you. But they did, but only for these limited periods of time. So eventually she ended up at her mother's house in a place called Tivoli, New York, which is about 25 miles north of Hyde Park here, to her grandma, Grandma Hall. And Grandma Hall was a very strict religious-based woman. Her husband was a very strict religious-based man. They didn't believe in singing around the house except on Sundays, because, song is a gift from God, so it should be kept for that special day. And Granny had a bit of a temper. If she asked Eleanor to do something and Eleanor messed it up, she would berate Eleanor. But we talked about this. So let's say, Eleanor, I need you to go set the dining room table for lunch. And Eleanor goes in there and she puts the forks on the wrong side. And Granny Hall walks in. We talked about which side the fork goes on. I can't believe how many times we have to go over this. And she'd berate her and yell at her right there. And then she would give her the cold shoulder for 3 or 4 days. Right. And so this is not, again, a very warm, happy, especially loving place to grow up. But it gets even worse. There are 2 uncles that live there as well. And these 2 uncles are also alcoholics. And what they do for fun is they get drunk in the afternoon and they go up to the attic and they open the windows of the attic and they literally shoot at Eleanor with a rifle. So if Eleanor is at the potting shed and she just pots a flower and sits it down and goes to get the next one, they would shoot the one that she just potted just to see her jump. Or if she had just gotten back from a ride on her pony and was brushing down the pony and the pony was having a snack, they might shoot into the bale of hay just to see the pony jump, just to see Eleanor jump. And they thought that was a heck of a lot of fun. So you don't have to be, again, a rocket scientist to understand that this is not a good environment for a young woman to be growing up in. And Granny Hall recognized that. And so she packed up Eleanor at the age of about 15, and she sent her over to Allenwood School over in England, just outside of London. And it's at that school that Eleanor Roosevelt meets this woman, Madame Silvestri. Madame Silvestri is the headmistress of the school there, the Allenwood School. And Madame Silvestri takes an interest in Eleanor Roosevelt. She is the first person to see in Eleanor Roosevelt what the rest of the world will see later on. But she's the first one to see this, and Eleanor's 15 years old. And she says to Eleanor, you've got some good ideas. You're pretty smart. You should write about what you're thinking. You should write about what you're feeling. You should travel as much as you can. Come on some trips with me. You should argue with the other girls in the school. They have opinions. You have opinions. Take them on, see who's got the better opinion. See if they can back up what their opinion is. And Eleanor Roosevelt really grows in this 3 years. In fact, she says that it is the 3 happiest years of her life. And she keeps this picture on her desk for the rest of her life, this picture of Madame Silvestri. So we have Madame Silvestri to thank for beginning to pull Eleanor out of her shell. So she's over there for 3 years and she graduates. Now she's got to come back to the United States. She comes back to New York. and she lives with an aunt in New York City, and she goes to work in a tenement house, teaching basic life skills and things to people living in a tenement house, little English, little math skills, those sorts of things. And she ends up bumping into an old cousin of hers, an old friend of hers, a guy by the name of Franklin Roosevelt. Now, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt had first met when he was 4 and she was 2. And they met right here on the property. The Roosevelts were famous for having these big family reunions. And so there was a family reunion, and Eleanor's parents brought her here to Hyde Park, and she met Franklin when she was 2, he was 4. They played together as children. And then over the years, they had kind of, reconnected here and there across the time frames at the various family reunions. But Franklin and Eleanor hadn't seen each other for 3 years while she was over there in England. And when they see each other again, they fall in love, sparks fly, right? It's really everything you would want in a young, couple's relationship. So up to this point, right, she's been betrayed by her mother, who doesn't think she's cute enough, betrayed by her father, who puts alcohol before her interests, betrayed by her extended members of the family who will take her in, but for a limited time only, betrayed by her grandma, who says, yeah, you can come live with me, but I'm going to ride your butt the whole time, and betrayed by these uncles who think it's funny to shoot rifles at her. Now she meets Franklin, re-meets Franklin, and they fall in love. And I want you to understand that this love was an incredible love. It was exactly what you would want in young people. In fact, Franklin gives her the nickname, my angel. Okay, now that's a big promotion from Granny, don't you think? So they fall in love, and Eleanor wants to shout from the rooftops, I'm in love with Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt ends up saying, you know what, I want to marry you, Eleanor Roosevelt. And they decide to get engaged. Now she is 19, he's 21. And he tells his mother, hey, Mom, I'm going to marry Eleanor Roosevelt. And Sarah says, whoa, 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 wait a minute. Who? What? What's going on here? I'm going to marry Eleanor Roosevelt. Whoa, whoa, whoa. You're 21. She's 19. You guys are too young. And basically nobody in the mind of Sarah would have been good enough for her boy, Franklin. So she says, all right, you guys, all right, here's what we'll do. Keep the engagement quiet for like a year, okay? We'll just sit on this for a year. And then she takes Franklin on a 6-week cruise through the Caribbean, hoping he'll forget all about Eleanor. So this, I think, is another form of betrayal, right? You're 19 years old, you're finally coming into your own. And by the way, here's what she's looking like at that time. Huh? Wow. Knockout, I think, right? Really cute, nice hair, right? She's softened that bang situation that she had earlier. Look at those nice, sort of like they're burning almost. Her eyes are very deep, and they're just looking right into you. And she's a beautiful, beautiful young woman, and she's finally starting to feel like a beautiful, beautiful young woman. And her future mother-in-law says, "Wait, stop, sit down. Let's keep it quiet for a year." So she's unable to talk about this, for a whole year. And the year goes by, but they end up staying in love, and they end up getting married. And they get married on March 17th, 1905, St. Patrick's Day. Now, they get married on St. Patrick's Day, not because they loved leprechauns, but because it happened to be the only day that her favorite uncle, Uncle Teddy, was able to walk her down the aisle, right? Her father has passed away by this point. She's got nobody to walk her down the aisle. And so she says, well, Uncle Teddy, would you do it? And he goes, oh, bully, I'd love to do it. Oh, yeah, but the only time I can do it is March 17th, 1905, right? And they're like, okay. And the reason it had to be on March 17th was because Uncle Teddy, who happened to be president of the United States at the time, was going to be in New York City for the St. Patrick's Day parade. So he said, here's what I'll do. I'll go to the parade, and then I'll do that. I'll swing over to your place. I'll walk you down the aisle, and I'll get back to the parade before anybody even knows I'm missing. No, that's not going to happen. It's Teddy Roosevelt. They're going to know you're missing. And because he was coming to the apartment in New York, I heard the aunt's apartment where they were going to get married, There was all kinds of security and traffic tie-ups and all sorts of things like that. And it just created this whole big giant circus around the whole thing. Now, here is a rare picture of Eleanor Roosevelt in her wedding dress. And this was taken in January of 1905. And I just read Myra's lips. She said, "Oh, she's so pretty." Yes, she absolutely is. And isn't that great? So she's in this beautiful dress. This was taken in January. It's at the fitting. And this dress was bought for her by her aunts. They pitched in and they bought this. And this is what she looked like on her wedding day. Well, on the wedding day, they're in New York, and Uncle Teddy shows up and he walks her down the aisle, and she says she feels like a bit player at her own wedding. So once again, a sense of betrayal, right? He didn't mean to steal all the attention away, but his own daughter, Alice, once said, "My father likes to be the baby at every christening, the bride at every wedding, and the corpse at every funeral," right? He just had to be the center of attention, whether he meant to be or not. So on her wedding day, the day that she should be the center of attention, it's all about her. It wasn't all about her. It was about Uncle Teddy. And she learns a very valuable lesson from this, and we'll get back to that in just a couple of minutes. So the kids, they get married, they go off, right, like anybody would, and they go off to Europe for 3 months. Right, I went to New Jersey for the weekend but hey, that's another story. It's another story. So they go off to Europe for 3 months on a nice, beautiful honeymoon, and they go all over the place. They go to England, Scotland, France, Italy, Switzerland, all these places. And while they're there, Franklin's mother, says, I got to get the kids something. I got to get the kids something for a gift. And what she does is she goes to New York, and she has a townhouse built for them. And the townhouse is still there. It's part of Hunter College, 49 West 65th Street. And if you look at this building, there's like one door in the front, and then it's a 6-story building, and there's a series of windows up each side. So when you go to this building, you go into that door, and then you're in a small little vestibule. And in that vestibule, there are 2 doors. One door led to a 6-story apartment for Franklin and Eleanor, and the other door led to a 6-story apartment for Sarah, right? So she could, live with the honeymooners, with the newlyweds. And on various floors, she had doors that connected her apartment to theirs, with the locks on her side, not the kids' side, right? So whenever I think I've got a mother-in-law issue, I always think back to Sarah. And I think, well, I suppose it could be a little worse. And so what ends up happening is this is yet another form, inadvertently, of betrayal for Eleanor. You see, when Sarah gave them that house, what can you say? "Oh, thanks for building me a house, but I don't want to live there." Of course, they had to do that. But she furnished it with furnishings to her likings. And it was the house that she had built on 65th Street. So Eleanor was looking forward to getting married, coming back, and then going house hunting with Franklin. This was really important to her because she never had a home of her own. And now she had an opportunity to have one, but it was taken away by Franklin's mother. So what are you going to do, right? You got to put up with it. So then, they begin to have a family. And they have 6 children, 5 of which live to be adults. One of them dies in infancy. And Eleanor doesn't really know how to be a mom, right? She's never had a good role model for a mother. And so she's a little bit timid. She's shy. And she spends 10 years either just having had a baby or about to be having another baby. And she's a little overwhelmed. And so Sarah comes in, and before Eleanor has a chance to get her bearings as a parent, and you know what that's like, right? We've all had kids, and, it takes a while to get used to that, right? Oh, you got to feed them every day. Okay. All right. That's good to know. Right. But before Eleanor has this sense of being able to, make that link and that connection with the children, Sarah steps in and begins to kind of mother hen them all and sort of pushes Eleanor off to the side. Yet another form of betrayal. Now, Franklin begins his political career, And he runs for the first he starts off as the state senator here from New York. So he goes to our capital in Albany. While he's there, he puts the name of Woodrow Wilson in nomination for the presidency. And when Woodrow Wilson wins, he appoints Franklin Roosevelt to be the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So now they've got to move down to Washington, D.C. So they move down to Washington, which is kind of good because it puts a little more distance between them and Sarah, although Sarah finds an apartment down there so she can visit all the time. But she's down there, and Franklin is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And the job consists of two parts. The first part is you got to travel all around the world to all the various American naval bases to make sure that, the ships are all ship shape and the sailors are all, doing whatever they do to look like they're sailory and, all that sort of stuff, right? You got to make sure, hey, if you're going to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy, you got to make sure the Navy's ready to go. He loves it. He loves traveling. He loves the Navy. But of course, Eleanor's stuck at home with the kids and Sarah says, oh, I better help you. So she's back in the picture there again. The other part of the job is not being out there all around the world, but when you're at home in Washington, D.C., you need to go to all the cocktail parties in Washington because you've got to rub elbows with all the rich folks and with the congressmen and the senators, and you got to sort of, suck up and be all nice and everything because, you got to help build support for the Navy. So Franklin says, all right, I could do that. And he brings Eleanor with him. Now, Eleanor finds this to be very uncomfortable. Although Madame Silvestri has brought her out a little bit from her shell, she's still very shy. She's still very timid. She's still very quiet. And these cocktail parties serve cocktails. And she doesn't like to be around alcohol for obvious reasons, right? Her father an alcoholic and the uncles. So she says to Franklin, I can't go with you anymore. I can't go. It's too hard. I can't make small talk. I don't like to be around the drink. I can't go. And so you're going to have to go by yourself. And he says, I can't go by myself. What are you crazy? I just can't go to these things. And she says, well, then you'll have to take somebody else. And he's like, well, who could I possibly take? And Eleanor suggests, well, how about Lucy Mercer? Dun, 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 dun. The other woman. Now, Lucy Mercer is a lot of fun at a cocktail party, right? Lucy Mercer can tell a good joke. She can hold her liquor. She's pretty darn cute. And Franklin falls in love with her. And we don't know when the affair began, but we do know when it ended. And it ended in 1918 after the war was over. Franklin came back from Europe and had a touch of pneumonia. And he went to that townhouse that his mother had bought for them. And he said to Eleanor, I don't feel so good. I'm going to just leave my stuff here in the lobby and go upstairs and lay down. Right. And that's exactly how he sounded, by the way. And so he leaves all the stuff. He goes upstairs and Eleanor, the dutiful wife, says, OK, I will help you unpack. And she begins to unpack. And in the luggage brought back, she finds a satchel of love letters from good old Lucy Mercer. Right. So now she's been betrayed by her husband. Right. Who not only betrays her, but betrays her with her social secretary, her own social secretary. Can you imagine how tense that Christmas party must have been that year? Okay. But there you have it. Right. So Sarah steps in and she says, whoa, what's going on here? And well, Franklin cheated on me. There you go. And so Eleanor offers Franklin a divorce. She says, you know what? If you love this woman as much as these letters seem to say, then you need to be with her, not with me. And Franklin does not take her up on it. He says, no, we'll work it out. We'll work it out. And the reason that they wanted to work it out, there was two reasons. One was Louis Howe, FDR's political advisor, said, listen, if you get divorced, your career's over, right? There's going to be no career for you politically, because if you can't run a family, how are you going to run a state? How are you going to run a country? It's over, right? That's how it was back in those days. The second, more important force was Sarah. Sarah said to Franklin, listen, pal, you found this girl, you married this girl, you cheated on this girl, you make it right with this girl. Because if you divorce her, I am cutting you off from the Roosevelt family fortune. So work it out, pal. And it's at that point that the lovey-dovey marriage, the lovey-dovey relationship breaks apart and becomes really more of a partnership. Okay, really more of a partnership, like two pistons on a machine going back and forth, getting things done, working together, but not ever really connecting. And their relationship at that point was still based, I think, on love, but it was also based on a mutual idea that you needed to help other people, a mutual idea of public service, and a mutual belief in advancing the lives of other people. That's what it was based on at that point. No longer trust, no longer love. Now, before I go any further, I missed showing you this picture. This is a picture of Sarah and Eleanor. And I love this picture because it shows you, I think, you know, they always say a picture's worth 1,000 words. Look at the body language in this picture, okay? So you have Sarah, here's Sarah. She's standing here with her back all nice and straight. Her head is straight here, her chin set, and she's got this book of some kind that she looks like she's almost reading Eleanor, the Roosevelt family rule book. And she's looking directly into the eyes of Eleanor. Then you've got Eleanor over here. Her back is bent, her head is down. She's not looking directly at Sarah. She's clasping her hands as if to say, oh my gosh, I hope I'm going to be able to do this. This is it tells a lot about the relationship of these two, and it tells a lot about the dominance that Sarah had over Eleanor. So they say, okay, well, we'll work out this thing. Sorry about that. You know, and you know what I'm going to do, Eleanor? Here's what I'm going to do. Not only am I sorry, not only do I want to stay married, but I promise I will never see Lucy Mercer again. And he does one of these. Right? You know how when you cross your fingers, then you're able to get away with a lie. Okay, it doesn't work, by the way, on the witness stand. But so anyway, the idea of this is he says, I'll never see her again, never. And he keeps that secret, that promise for quite a long time. So let's take a step back. She's betrayed by her mother, who calls her granny, her father, a neglected alcoholic, the extended family who will take her in, but not on any length of time, her grandma, who has a very stern, strict household that she runs, her uncles who, put their fun and frolic while drunk before her safety. She meets Madame Silvestri, who begins to pull her out of her shell a little bit. She comes back, she meets Franklin, she wants to get married, she wants to scream from the rooftops that she's found this great guy that she wants to marry, and her future mother-in-law says, whoa, sit on it, all right, keep a lid on it here for a year. And she does that. Finally, the day comes. She wants to be the center of attention at her own wedding, and her Uncle Teddy inadvertently steals all of the attention away from her on that day. So then she decides, okay, well, we'll have a family. They start having a family. Her mother-in-law steps in and basically, sidesteps and pushes her out of the way from developing a relationship with her children and becoming the mother that she could become. And then her husband gets this job where he's away half the time. And then the other time that he's in town, he's dragging her off to these uncomfortable parties. And he's still finding time to have a little old mistress on the side. That's a heck of a lot of betrayal going on in the life of anyone, okay, of anyone. Now, a minute ago, I said that there was a lesson to be learned from that March 17th, 1905 situation, right? So we fast forward now, and we fast forward to the Roosevelts are in the White House, and there is going to be a concert at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. And this is in February of 1939. And at that concert is supposed to be a young African-American woman by the name of Marian Anderson, who's supposed to sing at that concert. But they won't let her sing at the concert because she's an African-American. And Washington is a segregated city at that time. So she's happens to have this friend, Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor's like, oh, weren't you going to sing at that concert? And she goes, yeah, well, I was going to, but they won't let me. What do you mean they won't let you? Well, I'm Black, so they're not going to let me do it. So Eleanor says, well, who's running that show anyway? And it comes to find out it was a group called the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. And just so happens, Eleanor was a member of that organization. So she said, hey, I'm a member of that organization. I am going to resign my membership in that organization if they don't let you sing. And so they wouldn't let her sing. Eleanor Roosevelt resigned her membership in the DAR. This created a lot of controversy, a lot of publicity. And 6 weeks later, on Easter Sunday, a concert was arranged on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And at that concert, guess who was featured? None other than Marian Anderson. There she is doing her concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, right there with old Abe Lincoln in the back, and 75,000 people attended this concert, way more than ever would have seen her at the Constitution Hall concert. Now, one very important person was invited to this, a woman by the name of Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, I'd love to go, but I'm not gonna. And you would think, well, wait a minute, weren't these guys friends? Marian Anderson, and Eleanor, Eleanor gave up her membership in the DAR because they wouldn't let Marian Anderson sing. But Eleanor Roosevelt remembered back to March 17, 1905. She knew that if she went to this concert, everybody would be writing about Eleanor Roosevelt attends concert for some African-American woman, right? And so she didn't want to steal Marian Anderson's moment in the sun. So she stayed back, and Marian Anderson was indeed the star of the show. Now, I love that story because to me, that is the quintessential story of Eleanor Roosevelt. If you were to ask me, what words would you describe? Betrayal and compassion. If you were to ask me to describe one incident in Eleanor Roosevelt's life that captures who she was, it's the Marian Anderson story, because she knew and she learned that lesson in 1905, and she carried it all the way on up to 1939. So that to me really speaks a lot about who she was. So then we fast forward April 12th, 1945. And Franklin Roosevelt's just gotten back from Yalta, and he goes down to Warm Springs, Georgia, and he wants to rest up and get, reinvigorated because he's about to die. And so what happens is he's up there, he's down there in Warm Springs, Georgia. Eleanor is up in Washington. And on April 12th, President Roosevelt faints. And so they call the White House. Oh, Mr. Roosevelt, the president has fainted. She said, all right, well, keep me posted. I know he's down there resting up. So, let me know if anything changes. And then 3 hours later, the phone rings. Mrs. Roosevelt, the president's dead. All right. He'd had a cerebral hemorrhage. And around about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he said, oh, I have a terrific headache, lost consciousness, and then died around 3:35 that afternoon. Mrs. Roosevelt now has to go down. She wants to go down and be with the body and bring the body back. So she's like, well, gee, I don't know. Am I able to fly on a plane, a government plane? I'm not really first lady anymore. And Harry Truman says, yes, you are. You could use the plane. Go. Right. So she goes down there. She gets down to Warm Springs, Georgia, and she comes in and she says, well, what happened? What was going on? Where was there? I need to know everything that was happening down here. And so somebody said, well, let's see. The president was sitting for a portrait right over there next to Lucy Mercer when he lifted. What did you say? I said he was sitting over there next to Lucy Mercer. Lucy Mercer? Dun, 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 dun. The woman that he had promised he would never see again? Now she's betrayed not once, but twice by Franklin and Lucy Mercer. And she is devastated. He promised he would never see her again. And yet somehow they had reconnected. But wait, it's even worse. Right. So she said, well, how did this happen? Who connected these two up? Right. And over in the corner, her daughter was like, right. It was her own daughter, Anna, who reconnected Lucy Mercer with Franklin Roosevelt. And Eleanor was now once again betrayed by her own daughter. And she said to her, Anna, how could you do this to me? And Anna said, well, Mom, when you're president, everybody that comes through the door wants something. They want a congressional, something put in their congressional district. They want you to campaign for them. You want them to make it speak. Somebody's always looking for something from the president. Daddy needed to be with people he could just be himself with. And Lucy Mercer was one of those people. She didn't want to be with him because he was Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States. She wanted to be with him because he was Franklin Roosevelt, right? Somebody that she really cared a lot about. And when Eleanor heard this from Anna, she said, "You're right. You're right. That was a good thing you did for Papa. That was a nice thing. You know, he needed that in his final, days here." And that's incredible, right? If that were me and my kid, I would be like, "You go to your room. There's going to be no TV, no pudding. Forget driving the car till you're 90, right?" It would be like, I would be right down on that. Like, but she forgave her. She forgave her. So Eleanor Roosevelt, a woman who's lived her entire life being betrayed time and time and time again by people that she loved, people that she cared for, people that she trusted. And I don't know about you, but if all that stuff had happened to me, if only a quarter of that stuff had happened to me, I would become a bitter, grisly old man, and never trust people again and always be looking for the worst in people. But that's not who Eleanor Roosevelt was. Eleanor Roosevelt took all of that hurt. Eleanor Roosevelt took all of that pain. Eleanor Roosevelt took all of that betrayal, and she turned it into compassion. She worked the rest of her life to make sure that other people didn't feel that if she could find a way to work for people, to prevent them from having to feel that sense of betrayal, that sense of being on the outside looking in, that sense of not being cared for, that sense of being pushed aside, that's how she would dedicate her life. And that's where the word compassion comes in. She built compassion from the betrayal, the hurt, and the heartache. And before we go to Q&A, I want to read a bit of a eulogy that was given for Eleanor Roosevelt by her friend, Adlai Stevenson. This is on November 17th, 1962, at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. And I quote, Adlai Stevenson said, "She lived 78 years, most of the time in tireless activity, as if she knew that only a frail fragment of the things that cry out to be done could be done in the lifetime of even the most fortunate. One has the melancholy sense that when she knew death was at hand, she was contemplating not what she'd achieved, but what she had not quite managed to do. And I know she wanted to go when there was no more strength to do. Yet how much she had done, how much still unchronicled. We dare not try to tabulate the lives that she salvaged, the battles known and unrecorded that she fought, the afflicted she comforted, the hovels she brightened, the faces and places near and far that were given some new radiance, some sound of music by her endeavors. What other single human being has touched and transformed the existence of so many others? What better measure is there of the impact of anyone's life? There was no sick soul too wounded to engage her mercy. There was no signal of human distress which she did not view as a personal summons. There was no affront to human dignity from which she fled because the timid cried danger. And the number of occasions on which her intervention turned despair into victory, we may never know. Her life was crowded, restless, fearless. Perhaps she pitied most not those whom she aided in the struggle, but the more fortunate who were preoccupied with themselves and cursed with the self-deceptions of private success. She walked in the slums and ghettos of the world, not on a tour of inspection, nor as a condescending patron, but as one who could not feel complacent while others were hungry, and who could not find contentment while others were in distress. This was not sacrifice. This, for Mrs. Roosevelt, was the only meaningful way of life. And I couldn't agree more. Let's open it up to some Q&A.
That was a wonderful tribute and beautiful, my God, eloquently and beautifully written. So
Awesome.
who has a question that Jeff can answer or respond to? See how, I want to make sure I can see everybody. Okay, Madeline, unmute yourself.
This isn't a question, it's a comment. I'm 91 years old. I met her when I was in my 20s. My husband was chairman of a lecture series where she was invited, and we were invited to a dinner to attend before the lecture. I had 4 children. The oldest was 5. We were late wherever we went. And we got to the dinner late, and the table was completely filled. There was no room for us. So we went to the buffet table and we got our dinner. And there were a couple of steps between the living room and the dining room, and we just sat down on the floor to eat our dinner. And I hear a voice behind me saying, "May I join you?" And I looked up, and it was Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, this was late in her life, and it seemed that she was wearing a body corset. And my husband says the only time in his life he ever knew me to be speechless. But she sat down on the floor with us and asked us about everything, about all the current events and what our opinions were. And I understand from people who knew her that that was so typical. She would seek out the youngest person in the room and ask them their opinions about all these big issues. But I never forgot it.
Wow, that's amazing. That's great. That is very typical. I mean, it's a unique experience for you, but that's who Mrs. Roosevelt was. She wanted to, you didn't have a seat at the table. And literally, she devoted her life to getting people a seat at the table, whether it was people of color, women, children, workers, migrants, you name it. She wanted to bring them in and make them feel a part of what the situation was. So that's amazing. What a great story. Do you remember what you were eating? How could you, right?
I really didn't care. I just couldn't believe that this large woman wearing a corset would sit down on the floor.
Yeah, that's Eleanor Roosevelt. Anybody else? Thank you for sharing, by the way. That's great.
I have a question. You
Yes.
talked about Teddy Roosevelt walking Eleanor down the aisle. So what was it like with the two factions? I'll call them the Roosevelt family coming together for that wedding. Was it tense? In this day and age of politics, things can get pretty hostile pretty quickly. So I was just curious how they managed that.
No, that was fine. There was no tension whatsoever. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt was a big fan of Teddy Roosevelt, as was Eleanor Roosevelt. And Teddy was a very early hero and mentor of Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt set his path to the presidency by following the same path that Teddy Roosevelt did. He was a state senator from New York. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. They both had the same job. They both followed each other. Teddy Roosevelt was the governor of New York, as was Franklin Roosevelt, and they both ran for vice president. The only job that Teddy Roosevelt had that Franklin Roosevelt didn't have was New York City Police Commissioner. So although Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, he was a progressive Republican. And so a progressive Republican was very much like, a Democrat back in those days. And by looking back now, we think, Roosevelt was this great liberal, but he really wasn't that liberal for his time. I mean, let me rephrase that. He was liberal for his time, but he was really, far more conservative than people give him credit for, right? So for example, like when the banking crisis happened, he didn't throw out the banking system, he fixed the banking system. He believed in making the system work. And so that's what he was looking to do. So the way that he tweaked these things were very progressive methods and ways, and that's exactly what Teddy Roosevelt would have done. And the fact that both Franklin and Eleanor idolized him, really went a long way as well. So there was no friction or anything like that.
So I remember a program back in I think it was the 1970s, Franklin and Eleanor, I think it was called, and it was a mini series. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of tension with Sarah, Franklin's mother, and the family. And the impression, the way I recall it, is that really, even though she supported her, Eleanor, it really never changed.
Yes and no. As a matter of fact, I'm giving a talk next Wednesday. If you guys are interested, you can go to our Facebook Live page, come to the museum webpage. I'm giving a talk on Sarah Roosevelt in honor of Mother's Day. And Sarah has gotten a bad rap.
Okay.
Sarah was a very strong, very determined, very uncompromising woman, just like Eleanor Roosevelt eventually became. And I think that there was a lot of misconception in their relationship. The thing that they shared most was Franklin. And of course, that was a bone of contention as well, because Sarah, saw him as hers, and Eleanor wanted him as hers as well. So there was some tension there. The fact that they were both very strong, determined women, ultimately, there was some tension going on there. But there was also a huge generational gap. Sarah was a woman from the Victorian era, and Eleanor was a woman from the Progressive era. And so, there was going to be some natural friction between, the way young people want to do new things and such. So that's really where all of that came from. But for Hollywood purposes, and this goes back to that movie Sunrise at Campobello, which came out like in the 50s, I think it was. Every show has to have a bad guy, right? You can't have Popeye without Brutus. You can't have Tom without Jerry, right? So it's
You're
hard
dating yourself.
Well, this is all from the History Channel.
Okay.
And so the idea here is that there had to be a bad guy. And in this particular case, Sarah was the easy one to peg as the bad guy. So a lot of that was overstated. And, I wouldn't say they were pals, but, when the push came to shove, Sarah was there for Eleanor, and Eleanor was there for Sarah. But they had two vastly different views of the world and two vastly different ways of going about what they wanted to get done.
Okay, well, thank you for clarifying that.
You're welcome. Anybody
else before we wrap up today's program? Oh, it looks like I don't know who this is, but
it's Marilyn. It's Marilyn Alton. Anyway.
Oh, Marilyn.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's just fabulous.
Oh, thank you.
The observation I wanted to make, isn't it ironic that she had to share her husband with her mother and with his mother and a mistress? But the thing that comes across to me is this goes against what every psychiatrist and doctor said, because in every incident, her self-esteem and confidence was taken away. How did this not affect her in later life? I mean, this was so unusual, because this is my main thought about it, because she had really everyone just a self-demeaning, where people took her confidence away, and her mother and her father drinking, and on and on and on. How did this not affect her?
Well, I think it did affect her, but I think it affected her in an opposite direction. I think what she took upon herself to become like a superhero and say, okay, you know what? I'm going to use all of this pain, all this hardship, and I'm going to use that as a superpower. And I am going to make sure that nobody else in the world, if I can help it, is going to feel that way. I don't want people feeling like I feel. So I'm going to work for people of color, for migrants, for children, for workers, for the disabled, all of these people who were very much like her, sort of pushed to the side or not really included, or their impressions and their ideas weren't really taken very seriously. She made sure that they were going to come to the forefront. And because she had the ear of a president who was president for 12 years and was actively involved in making things happen, she used that as a platform for saying, you know what, not only can I do something, but I'm this close to power to be able to do it. And so that's really where it came from. And that's what makes her so remarkable. Because as I said, if it were me, I'd be over in the corner eating Twinkies the rest of my life. I'd be an emotional basket case. But she said, no, I'm not going to let this happen to other people. I'm going to do something about it.
She was an inspiration.
She
an inspiration.
she was not only was an inspiration, she still is. You know, kids do this thing in school now called History Day, where there's like it's like a national competition, and there's like themes about history, and every year it's a different theme, and almost every year you can relate it back to Eleanor Roosevelt somehow. And there are young boys and girls who are inspired by Mrs. Roosevelt even to this day, and they use her as their History Day project. Nancy says, Franklin called her, you're welcome, his legs and sent her out to see what was going on. And then she felt useful, which was her way. Yeah, not only that, Nancy, he not only sent her out, but he sent her out with marching orders. He said, you know, if you're going out to Missouri, let's say, and you're going to go out to Kansas City, I want tell the train guy, the conductor, to let you know 10 minutes before you get there. Because as First Lady, they're going to show you all the best places, all the spiffed up, cleaned up places. But what you're going to do is if you go out 10 minutes before, out onto the back of the train, and you look around and see what you see, you're going to get a much better idea of what kind of condition that city is in. You're going to see the condition of the cars. What are the children playing with? What do the clothes look like on the clotheslines? Are the houses being kept up? You know, are the lawns being mowed? This will give you a better idea of what it's like there than it is if you just go to the fancy places that they want you to see, right? It's kind of like when people come over to your house, right? You know, you close all the doors and try to keep them in one room. Well, you know, that's kind of the way it was when you're First Lady. He also said, if you go to a soup kitchen and they tell you that they're serving chicken gumbo, stick your nose in the pot, because we're paying for chicken gumbo. We're not paying for oatmeal. And if they're serving oatmeal, you call them out for it, because that's not what they're supposed to be doing. So she was an incredible source of information for him, information that he could trust, information he could rely upon. And, you know, she would bring that back to him. And that's what made them this great partnership. I wish she hadn't cheated on her. I'm an old softie. I want everybody to end, you know, happily and live happily ever after and everything. But you know, it's one of those things that did make her a bit of a stronger person. And we'll talk about that next time in the next session. And, you know, it's you know, it's the way it is, right? You know, sometimes people do things that hurt you, but nonetheless, I think they were a great pair and, you know, certainly an inspirational couple.
Is there one last question, quick question?
Yeah.
Is there any other president's wife that you would compare to her and be as great as she was?
I would say, well, that's a good question. Maybe Dolly Madison, maybe Martha Washington. People say that Eleanor Roosevelt changed the role of the First Lady, and I don't think that she did. I think she stretched it out a little bit for the time, but since that time, there has never been a First Lady who was as you know, consequential as Eleanor Roosevelt. You know, each First Lady since then has adopted kind of a cause, right? You know, Michelle Obama, healthy eating, Laura Bush was reading, you know, Rosalind Carter was mental health, you know, all these different things, you know, Lady Bird Johnson, highway beautification. So they all had like one sort of signature theme that they worked on. Mrs. Roosevelt worked on dozens of signature themes all at the same time. So I would think, you know, just historically speaking, maybe Dolly Madison and Martha Washington, but that would be the only other two that come to my mind.
Patty,
Thank
do you
you.
have a question or a comment? I see you hit your hand up earlier. Patty, can you hear me?
Yeah. Am I on now?
Yes, you are.
Am I on? Yeah, it's just a comment. I just, when you talk about an inspiration, I just want to tell you something that I keep on my refrigerator. And it's from Eleanor Roosevelt. It says, if anyone were to ask me what the purpose of life is, I would say the opportunity for doing a kind thing for someone else each day. In no other way, I am convinced, can true happiness be obtained. I keep that on my refrigerator. So she's still inspiring a lot of us.
Absolutely. Every day, all around the world, not just in this country, but all around the world. One of the things that I keep on my refrigerator, actually my wife keeps on the refrigerator, is a lock. And that's so that I don't go in and get all the beer and ice cream. But your thing is far more inspirational. By the way, if you know what's the key, let me know.
Okay, everyone, we're going to get together again next week. Jeff, another fabulous program. We really, really love you and appreciate how you make this wonderful story and wonderful person just come alive. So thank you again.
Well, I couldn't do it if you didn't make me. And of course, we've got the great audience that's interested in learning. And most important of all, a fantastic topic to talk about.
Yeah.
So
Thank you very much.
you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
See you next week.
Okie dokie.
Okay.